Hello, all. Welcome to our June COVES Community of Practice call. We are delighted to have several friends and colleagues from the Science Museum of Minnesota share with us today on some exciting work that they're doing around belonging in science centers, natural history museums, and museums broadly. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Evelyn and Sarah from the Science Museum of Minnesota to give quick introductions to themselves and then kickstart our Community of Practice call. Thank you so much, Evelyn, Sarah, and the rest of the Science Museum of Minnesota team.
All right, thanks so much for having us. I think Evelyn's getting the slide share right now, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Sarah Lukowski. I'm in the Evaluation and Research Department at the Science Museum of Minnesota, and our group has been embarking on this really cool study that we're excited to share about today. I'll pass to Evelyn.
Hello all, I'm Evelyn Ronning. I also work as an associate in the Department of Research and Evaluation at the Science Museum. We're really excited to share some early findings with you all, and I'm going to pass it to Marjorie for introductions.
Hi, everybody. This is Marjorie Paquette. I am both part of this project and also a regular member of the Community of Practice here as part of COVES in my role as director, and also as a person who's just been a longtime member of thinking about the power of joint measures across museums. And am I passing to Amy, or am I doing my intro now?
Pass to Amy.
Please, Amy. I'm not sure that Amy has joined yet. That's why I was checking there.
Yes, you may not have been prepared for that. So.
Yeah.
Trying to get off mute. Hi, everyone. Amy Grock Nelson, Evaluation Research Manager at the Science Museum of Minnesota. I'm a co-PI in this project and also a member of the COVES Question and Measures group. And my excitement of this project is our ability to try and figure out how we can conceptualize this idea of belonging in a way that we can hopefully create in the our long-term goal is to create some kind of measures so that we can have a long-term understanding of how we are creating a sense of belonging in our institutions and how we can better create institutions that are creating a sense of belonging in our visitors. And I will turn it back to Marjorie, I think, or whoever is next.
Yeah.
So I am just going to do a quick intro to this project and the big picture of why we're bringing this to the COVES community. And then Sarah and Evelyn are going to walk you through, as they said, initial findings. And we keep using that word initial because this study is ongoing. As a member of the COVES community, I know how deeply passionate all of you are about our visitor experience and how we make it the best that we possibly can. And over the past several years, I've been in so many conversations, both within COVES and also in other field-wide discussions where people have talked about this idea of belonging. And so at the Science Museum of Minnesota a couple of years ago, we were talking about this issue and we said, well, we could just start developing a measure. And then we said the literature that is out there is not fully based in museums. As a matter of fact, much of it is drawn from elsewhere. We're having a ton of conversations in museums among staff people about wanting to create a sense of belonging, but we actually didn't have a lot coming from visitors. And we know that there are times that we develop measures because we have a pretty strong conception of what we're trying to get at. So we can write a question and get to work on it pretty quickly. But because this idea is emergent, it's under discussion, and we just didn't have enough from visitors to be able to know what it would mean. Like if somebody said, I feel a really strong sense of belonging in this organization, it would feel good to us, but would it give us information to know what to keep, what to change, what what we would want to tell our peers and colleagues across the museum, we wouldn't have that information. So we got funding from the National Science Foundation to do a tier study where we would actually talk to visitors about their sense of belonging. We would have them explain it to us. And that's what Sarah and Evelyn are going to share with you today. I'm super excited to hear from them and to hear your questions as well. So I'm going to kick it back, I think, to Sarah.
Yep. So we, just as a grounding to get started, thinking we all come into this with our own probably personal definitions of belonging. As Marjorie said, as a field, we've been taking up this concept of belonging. And so I just want to put us back to ground us in a space of kind of imagine yourself on a visit, maybe to your own institution, to another institution, somewhere where you're a first-time visitor. What are the markers that say that you belong in that experience, in that space? What would you be looking for or noticing as experiences, moments during your visit that make a difference in your sense of belonging? So kind of just take a second, we'll take a pause, think about what that looks like to you, and then we'll dive in deeper. Okay, so hold that in mind, what belonging means to you, and I'm going to pass it now to Evelyn to talk a little bit about our state of the field review that we did before we dived into actual visitor interviews.
So we started this project with a survey of literature across a couple of different fields. Belonging as a concept has been taken up in the cultural institutional field, museums, et cetera, many years ago now, 8, 9 or so years ago, but more recently in educational and educational psychology in particular fields. And so we started out kind of to ground ourselves in how other fields had been thinking about this concept and operationalizing this concept in their own context as a starting point for us to understand what that looks like in a museum context. And so where we started with in terms of thinking about our own study and how we, would develop our instruments and how we're going to be thinking about this construct all along, is we kind of landed on a museum visit having aspects of a physical space, social support, and alignment with identity, because these were sort of big buckets or big categories that had been identified as we did the survey across the literatures. So let me tell you a little bit about each of those areas. And then as we go further into the presentation, you'll see that we're going to be showing you some of the data that we've collected and talking about some early findings in each of these areas. So physical space is probably one that we've thought a lot about in the museum field, and belonging in this context relates to how the environment, the physical environment, communicates messages of who belongs. So how is the setup of the space conferring belonging? How are individuals navigating the space, the arrangement of the materials, exhibits, et cetera, how kind of this connects to sort of societal understandings, right, of who belongs in this space as well. Moving to the next bucket, which is social support. Social support as a bucket kind of describes these, what we call kind of ever widening circles of social context. So that may or may not confer belonging to individuals. So individuals feeling of value or acceptance by others, by the institution, and how that kind of connects to society at large. We've started to think about it in terms of this kind of give and take relationship between individuals and an organization, sort of what's happening in the interaction or the relationship between individuals visiting the museum and the museum as an institution itself. And then recognizing within this bucket of social support that this is a very complex interaction that's taking place. And so, kind of what is happening between the individual, the place, and the process of deciding, who is valued in that space, and essentially what is valued. And lastly, the last bucket is an alignment with identities. So, this bucket, belonging, is configured by the identities that are marked largely within a social context of who belongs. And so it's both how individuals themselves are perceiving and enacting their identities within a social context. It's also about how identities are represented, and this really emergent way that belonging is constructed, in interaction with the institution based on individuals and group identities. And so each of these buckets we're going to be talking about in turn, but we also want, this is kind of a working model that we're using to sort of describe what we're seeing in our data at present. And so what sense of belonging looks like is these three buckets, but kind of swimming in a petri dish, since we're a science museum, kind of swimming in a petri dish of an emotional quality, emotional attachment to place, to people, to nostalgia for previous visits to an institution, or nostalgia to one's past and cultural inheritance. And also we're finding that memory is also playing a very important role in how these buckets are kind of surfacing and coming out in the data that we have been collecting thus far. So just to give you a little bit of background around the study, I'll start by saying that we are conducting, again, as Amy said, we are conducting a qualitative study with a mind towards creating a measure down the line. But we decided that we needed to start at the point of operationalizing, start at the point of kind of a ground up approach, and really asking people how they are understanding belonging, and in order to develop that ultimate measure. And so the way that we're doing this is through photo elicited interviews. We are collaborating with visitors across 4 different museum sites. We've done 3. We've done 2.5 full sites of data collection thus far. We've got another site and a half to go. We are doing maximum variation sampling, which in essence, what we're trying to do is get a wide array of different demographic categories and positionalities represented in our sample. We are attempting through our method to mimic a close approximation of a visit that someone might have. The data that we're collecting are photos, and we're using those photos in the interview to prompt reflections on belonging and when belonging was felt and when it was not felt across an entire museum visit. And so we're giving our visiting groups an iPod Touch, or a couple of iPod Touches, depending on the size of the group, to take across the museum visit and take photos as they go. And we're cueing folks to really be thinking about those moments that matter to their sense of belonging across the visit. And then at the end of their visit, we are conducting a photo elicited interview where we ask folks to choose 5 photos that they would like to talk about. And then we use those photos to talk about a range of topics related to belonging across their visit. And so, we're getting quite a bit of photo data, which we'd like to share with you today. And of course, we haven't embarked upon analysis just yet, but I'm going to pass it off to Sarah to fill in on the methods and what's next.
Sure. So like everyone said, we're looking particularly at moments that matter. And how we've defined that for folks is just the positive or negative experiences. And very quickly, it's become clear that there's experiences that are somewhere in between. So they now have the option to select that as well as they talk through their experiences with us. Every single photo that you see as part of the presentation today, so on the previous slide and this slide, are photos that visitors have taken and explained to us during their interview as either something positive or negative for their sense of belonging at the museum. So for example, if we take the picture on the top left with the hand, that was a negative moment because it was a moment in which a visitor that was left-handed couldn't actually interact with the interactive in the way that they wanted. And then there's positive moments like the one on the bottom right where the group is eating together and having feeling belonging in that moment of being together and enjoying a meal. We told folks that it can happen anywhere in the museum. So lots of pictures of exhibit halls, but also cafe, any of the other amenities that you might have at your site are ones that folks could take a picture of and describe their sense of belonging in that moment. So now we're just going to look at pictures that fall broadly into those bucket categories that we talked before and show support, at least some initial support for this model that we thought might work as a working model. So I'll pass that back to Evelyn.
So first, we're going to talk about physical space. And again, we're just going to present to you some big buckets here of how we're seeing these pictures sort of grouping within this bucket. So the first one is seating, finding seating that is both functional and in some cases, allows for certain types of engagement and or activities. And so these photos came up frequently across our data. In addition, finding restrooms and also noticing with regard to restrooms, other values associated with restrooms, including gender neutral or gender non-conforming restrooms being available did come up, but also just the availability of restrooms. Again, the idea that physical comfort is important in the space. There is an aspect of welcoming, right, that is part of belonging, and visitors do notice that. They notice where they are being welcomed and how they are being welcomed into a space, whether that's through staff and dedicated staff areas you can see on the left-hand side, or whether there's particular signage, as you can see in the right two photos of how folks are being welcomed into an exhibit space or into the museum as a whole. Being able to find one's space, finding one's way in the space, the directionality, knowing where to go, knowing, again, sort of feeling a sense of comfort that one knows how to navigate a space came up as important as well. The accessibility of the interactives, and this can mean a couple of different things across groups. So it can be both kind of exhibits and interactives are, at levels that are, of use to particular age ranges, but it can also be that there are multiple ways that a family group that might represent different age levels and different generational spans can interact together. So we see that kind of coming up in lots of different interesting ways. Language access is also key. And so we have both heard from folks for whom languages other than English were offered at exhibits through interactive and language-specific guides, specific exhibit labels, ASL interpretation, et cetera, where accessibility is key, but not just for members of a group that want those languages and require those languages represented. But we also noticed in talking with folks who maybe aren't utilizing those guides, that it's important also to others that those that kind of language access is readily available. Belonging is conveyed through prices in the space. And so I'll just explain a couple of what what folks were saying about these images. I think, the one on the left is obviously a cafe menu that was taken by a visitor. The one picture in the middle was a kiosk that was outside of a special exhibit, a kiosk area where things that were particular to that exhibit were on for sale, on display and for sale. And then also, many museums have particular special exhibit prices. And so that's a sign that's outside of a special exhibit. So what we're finding is, folks, again, there's a range here in terms of what folks are talking about, that the pricing is conveying whether or not something is available to a group or an individual, whether the products that are on display seem to have value for the price offered, but also a form of payment has also emerged as something that's important and is cueing belonging to folks as well. So for example, if only credit cards are accepted in the parking ramp on the way into the museum, that can be a first feeling of lack of belonging if one doesn't have a credit card to pay at that moment. So price is showing up again in a couple of different ways. Belonging also is finding food options for one's group that are, again, preferences that are necessary for dietary restrictions and or are culturally specific. And so these three photos represent photos that folks took that kind of address each of those areas. This one was one that we have noticed was a surprise to us in a lot of ways, and I think we were pleased when we started to see this coming up over and over again. And this is where visitors are taking pictures of very specific exhibits or signage that and or environment, physical space that roots the visitor in that particular place, that the region, the state, that is an important thing for folks to feel like this is a place where I belong. And I'm going to pass it to Sarah to talk about our social support findings.
Thanks, Evelyn. You can go to the next slide. So belonging is also interactions with staff or volunteers. The ways that staff and volunteers can really make a visitor feel like a VIP in a space has come out in multiple occasions. Next slide. Belonging is also interactions with other visitors, and like every other category, this can be positive or negative. So overhearing another visitor say something that's pretty blatantly racist in a race exhibit might be a negative experience for a visitor, but there's also positive interactions with other visitors, and maybe just as you see in the picture on the right, two children from different groups getting to play and race together some cars that they built. Belonging is also just simply finding something that interests you, and we hear this a lot, which is why there's a lot of different pictures on this slide, and it comes out in a lot of different ways. So we've focused on science and natural history museums in this study so far, but we hear findings of interest that are well beyond that. So for example, on the left, we see one youth that was particularly excited about finding an opportunity to incorporate design during their visit and designing a guitar within a broader exhibit about the history and science of guitars. Next slide. Belonging is also just being a part of it and like physically being a part of the experience. And so you see here 3 different visitors kind of deeply interacting with different things and kind of seeing themselves in the science. Next slide. Belonging is also being with your group. So as much as some of it has focused on maybe some of the content is the focus when we are thinking about interest. A lot of the times the visitors tell us that belonging isn't content specific at all, but just the feeling of interacting and being together in the space is what confers their feeling of belonging. And I'll pass it to Evelyn.
So our last bucket is identity. And I'll just say that our study here is focusing specifically on science museums and science centers and natural history museums. And so we are asking very specific questions about science identity, engagement, and interest. But I also want to say that I think one of the things that we're noticing, you know, in visitors to these spaces is that folks don't always have a science identity when they come into our spaces, and are, or they may not describe themselves as science people, but they are finding interesting ways to kind of attach the identities that are very strongly felt and elucidated to the content and the experiences that they're having in that space. The first that we want to sort of bring forward for you is these photos about folks seeing themselves in a fundamental way, seeing their identities in the exhibit space or in the experience. So focusing over to the photo on the left of my screen, I guess that'd be your screen as well, is a photo that a visitor took where their own cultural identity aligned with the content of the visit. There was some positive and negatives. We've often come to think of this as kind of describing a kind of a bittersweet moment in these photos where the individual was essentially saying, you know, this is behind a glass. You know, these important artifacts are kind of behind a glass. So I can't really, you know, access them. But at the same point in time, I see my identity. I see myself in this exhibit piece, and so that we've heard quite a bit of that kind of bittersweet sort of sentimentality. We often, you know, also heard from folks, and as you can see on the far right, that folks, you know, knowing what was sort of coming, what exhibits were within the space, and knowing some of the things that they might anticipate was important if that related to their identity, that they were excited, and if it was something that they felt very, very much related to their identity. And they would often take pictures of themselves within those spaces, as you can see in the bottom right, kind of, again, sort of seeing themselves visually within that space. The next is, again, kind of seeing yourself but in very interesting ways and very unexpected ways. And so it's not always a sort of a direct line from a given identity or intersection of identities to what the content of what's being presented is. And so I want to just here focus on these two top pictures of pairs of artifacts that were displayed into museums. And the one on the right is a picture of river otters, two sculptures, river otter sculptures, that the visitors were talking about, that they took this picture because it represented them and the person that they were with, and they saw themselves in those two river otters. And so they took that picture because for them, that represented something very important about the people, the identities of the people that they were with, and their identity collectively. And so we've heard that quite a few times in some interesting ways. The picture on the left is of an astronaut exhibit piece or display, and That picture came to us from a person who identifies as deaf, hard of hearing. And they had a lot to say about how that for them kind of symbolized the idea of being in space, and kind of symbolized the way that they navigate the world. So again, some of these ways in which people are seeing their identities in these spaces are not always, you might not necessarily know unless you ask, which we are fortunate enough to be able to do. We did encourage folks where they did have interactions with others to not photograph others that were not within their group, but to photograph nearby or to photograph in ways that those identities might be obscured. But noticing other people and other visitors particularly, and staff particularly, that share identities with visitors surfaced as something that was quite important to folks as well. And then seeing one's values represented in the space was also a theme of the data that we're seeing emerge. The photograph to the left was taken by someone who said, I'm really glad that this is there. This is a value that I share for recycling, minimizing our impact environmentally. And so I'm really glad that this is there. It helps both me to know what to do so that I can do the thing that I know is right. And I'm also really glad that it's here for other people as well. And so we've heard that come up in a number of different ways. In the middle picture, we've heard that in reference to racial justice and social justice that an exhibit around race addresses. And we also heard that value illuminated by visitors through describing their pictures. And now we're going to talk about this emotional piece, and I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Sure. So all of this is happening on a backdrop of a variety of emotion, memory, and nostalgia that folks come to the museum with. You can go on to the next slide. So belonging is memory, whether that's of a camping trip that you went on with your family and you find a signpost like that camping trip, or your abuela sharing a story about how the exhibit looks just like her childhood in Mexico. This is not every site, but all the sites that we happen to be going to have banks of windows in which you can see outside into really classic and important features of the area. So a lake, mountains, river systems. And we've heard from many visitors that their memory of interacting with those things brings a sense of belonging to their visit within the museum space. Next slide. Belonging is also nostalgia, and this is obviously mostly for repeat visitors. We hear this a lot from people that maybe visited as children with school groups and then came back as adults in our study now. Also, I'd like to highlight on the right, we actually had a group of twins that were in their 70s, and they said every time they see this dinosaur in the entranceway, it just meant belonging to them and that they were going to have a great time visiting that day because they'd always seen that since the 1950s onward on their visit to that space. Belonging is also a group's visit routine, and this, again, is mostly with repeat visitors and especially members. So members come fairly frequently compared to some other visitors, and they may come up with these visit routines that are somewhat unique to them as individuals, and they take pictures and talk with us about these special moments within the space that's important to their own sense of belonging during their visit. It's the things they always do. Next slide. And then finally, belonging is wider in memory and connection, and just thinking about the connection to the earth and the interconnectedness of humans and the natural systems around us, and what it means to just kind of be a global citizen as well. We hear from visitors as conveying belonging. All right, so what's next with these? We'll go to the next slide. First, we'd love to hear questions, comments, what resonates with you. Is anything surprising? Like we said, these are our initial preliminary findings. We still have 1.5 sites left of data to collect over the next about 2 months now. And then eventually we want to make this usable and scalable for more sites and thinking about what measures are down the road. And so how do we make this more usable? What sorts of pieces are you most excited about? We'd love to hear your thoughts as we start to plot out these future directions. And thank you so much for your time.
And as we move into questions, I would love to hear in particular, this has happened so far in science and natural history museums, but there's so many art museums on this call, and I'm really curious about what aspects of belonging, as visitors are describing it to us in these science and natural history museums, which of these feel like these would translate pretty easily into an art museum or a children's museum, whatever setting you are working in? And where does it feel like maybe there's some space to continue to investigate?
Yeah, Marjorie, I love that question. Probably not a surprise to you. Rachel at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Julie and Julie, our colleague at Crystal Bridges, are messaging on the side saying, yes, people find belonging and meaning in visual depictions. Like, yes, we see this resonance. This is amazing. You know, I think there's so much here that is at the core of what we've talked about in COVES too, that there's so much overlap in the visitor experience that comes up here when you think about the kind of setting the scene and offering information and amenity driven things. And I don't quite mean amenity as like something special. I mean, literally like what food is available? How much does it cost? What languages are those signs in? You know, I think that of course there's overlap for us there. And then as you're talking, I'm certainly thinking about the visual depictions piece. And both the how art museums do and don't invite visitors to interact with our objects. I think that will be a really interesting place for us to look at together. You know, children's museums also kind of really tackling that in important ways. And yeah, I see Julie saying like, I think all the themes you mentioned can apply to art museums. Yeah, like that overlap is definitely there. And what's also standing out to me is how you phrased it of sort of saying we didn't necessarily like encourage people to take pictures of the people around them, you know, so directly, but to just take note of how other people are interacting with or using this space feels like really important information to share across institutions. That idea that part of belonging is do I feel like I know how to act here, which, you know, you all are getting at in these really concrete ways. And then also, are there ways for me to learn from the other people around me that might be good or bad, you know, that might make me feel more or less welcome based on if their behavior feels more or less in line with my own, my family's, my friends. You know, I think this is a conversation that happens a lot of times in performing arts venues when it's like, you have to be quiet, you have to sit still, you have to, you know, like how much do those things translate across our different institutions? I think will be really interesting to dig into.
Thank you for that. I saw a comment in the chat about prompts for recruiting visitors for this particular study. So we had a pretty generic prompt that was help make museums places for visitors like you, and invited people to take part in a general museum visit study. And it wasn't until they'd been all the way recruited in and met us in the lobby that they found out that it was about belonging in particular. And we did that intentionally so that folks weren't signing up because they had some specific definition of belonging in mind or feeling like they needed to have one. So yeah, it was just a generic museum visit study. And then we met folks in the lobby. And again, the start is actually just an intro where we talk about like participating in the study and the tech mostly. And then we ask the groups, what does belonging, we tell them that it's going to be about belonging and that we don't know, we don't know what that means. And that's why we're having visitors help us define what belonging means to you, and that there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to hear what that means to you. And they give us some initial definitions, and then they take all their photos and we revisit that at the end as well. Like, now that you've taken all these photos, how are you feeling about this concept of belonging? And I see Evelyn popped in the chat our full ask for recruitment.
I don't want to cut anyone off if there are other questions coming through, but I had a question for you all that I thought of while you were talking about usability in your prompts. And that's, are there any areas, any of the categories where you noticed a lot of divergence, like a lot of, people taking pictures of the same type of thing, but really split on whether they felt like it was positive or negative for belonging?
I'm going to say, I think social support is one area where I think we're seeing a lot of divergence, because I think it can be very specific about, in particular, what folks need or are expecting in order to feel like they're belonging in an institution. And again, I think, each of these categories, are kind of interrelated. And so, it depends on kind of, one's identity, one's experience at the institution, whether one is a member or not. But social support and what that means in terms of other visitors in the space or staff members that might be supporting looks differently for people. And so we are noticing some differences in that area. That's sort of my initial hot take to your question, which is a really great question.
I'd like to build off that if possible, but similar to Alex, don't want to jump in if others have questions. But it's a tricky question, I think, which is good for all of us. So the themes that you've identified across the myriad things that you're looking at, you're focusing on a sense of belonging, right? And breaking it up into positive and negative. So the question I have is, what prevents a sense of belonging? Mm-hmm. Which could be as simple as, the things they identify as negative, right, in these pictures. But I guess beyond that, there's this question of, as the photo study, this is with visitors, people who have already chosen to come. So I'm wondering if there is the thought of an extension or already conducting some kind of an extension with people who have not chosen to visit to discuss their feelings of belonging in and around the spaces, because that could be so complicated it's not even worth it, but definitely wanted to ask because of the duality of this.
I'm going to do a first pass, and I'm going to ask Sarah and Evelyn to come back in. So, and I'm actually going to combine Ryan's question with a little discussion about incentive and recruitment in here. So clear limitation of this study, right? People are being invited to come to the museum. We are intentionally asking people, both people who come really regularly and people who have not visited recently or regularly. Yeah. And we are removing all barriers to their visit. So we are paying for their visit. We are giving them an incentive, and we are setting up their visit. We're getting no feedback on the purchase path, on the ease of getting accommodations. So for visitors who might normally say, I have a physical disability, or I want to understand, can I see this movie because I have my partner is hard of hearing. We are smoothing all of that. And so there's a huge gap in terms of what we're learning about the decision to visit. We have at times done not as large, but similarly intentioned studies where we've gone to other places that people go. And for us, the most successful, this is only going to work for our Twin Cities colleagues or people who have a similar place. We go to the Midtown Global Market, which is a former Sears building that has a ton of food vendors in it. That is situated in a really culturally diverse neighborhood and is the kind of place that you have to be okay with crowds to go, at least some of the time, and with sort of figuring out your way through. So it's similar, but obviously not the same. And then we've done interviews with people to ask about their perception of the Science Museum Minnesota, what makes them think about going or not think about going. It's been an incredibly useful place for us to tackle some of those questions, Ryan, that you are asking. So I just want to note as a limitation here, what we wanted to understand is once people made it to the museum, what is contributing to their sense of belonging? Sarah and Evelyn are doing a nice job of starting to understand what they are anticipating before they come as being challenges, and then what actually happens, that sometimes there's some interesting intersection. Well, I thought that you were going to be so sciencey that I wasn't going to have fun. And it turns out I did have fun, even though I'm not a science person. But we're not getting the full decision to visit, except inferentially through this study.
Yeah, that I would say that's exactly what we're getting. We also, though, we do get like what buffers within a visit. And so, for example, a group that maybe is deeply religious and then watches a movie about dinosaurs that kind of challenges some of those beliefs. How do they come to understand their belonging when some of their core beliefs are challenged during a visit? Like, we do hear stories around that. That's interesting to understand. How does a moment like that would be particularly challenging to your sense of belonging get buffered throughout your whole visit through other experiences?
Yeah, Sarah, I love how you're describing that as kind of buffering, because again, Ryan, I think that this is more of that kind of bittersweet, those kind of bittersweet aspects where someone's, kind of cultural identity, they might be super excited in one moment because they're seeing that represented and they're feeling like they're valued in that space. But then because they're visiting in a family group that is not heteronormative, they're feeling sort of larger societal pressures of feeling lack of value in that space, or maybe, negative attention that, is making them feel a lack of belonging in that space. And so, it does, it's that buffering, but I'm also thinking about it as a kind of, as these things are kind of adding up across a visit, sort of what does that look like? And it gets us to sort of what I think you're suggesting is like, what point is that a tipping point for then feeling a lack of sense of belonging in the space? And we're just not able to answer that through this particular study. I think what our study is going to be able to do is sort of point us in that direction. I think the other thing that I want to point out, and again say, we are conducting this in science centers and in science museums, and what we're finding, again, that we're inviting folks, as Marjorie said, in that are maybe from identity groups that aren't typically represented in our museum visitorship, proportional to our region, that we're finding a lot of surprise from folks that will say, well, I'm not a science person, but I really enjoyed this, that, or the other thing. I see myself as a history person, or I see myself as an art person. And so what's been really interesting is to see that, kind of people talking through that, the sense that when I was coming in here, I didn't think I was going to feel like there were things for me, or their interests that attached to my interests.
I see Tom's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Tom.
Hey there. I have a quick question. It sounds like this is probably very focused on the inside the museum experience, but I'm curious if any of the interview questions included anything about how folks feel like they belong beyond the museum, to how belonging they feel, how much they feel they belong to sort of the community or the city or the state or the world or whatever.
We did not ask that in particular. We did ask for folks to say their own definition of belonging, so that captures some of that, but we didn't explicitly, and that would be interesting to ask more broadly how folks are feeling belonging. But yeah, we don't have that in particular.
And I raised my hand again because I want to prioritize this question before we get to the end of the hour, which is for everyone on this call, what do you as the research team see as the natural extension to COVES down the road? Obviously, this is a very labor-intensive, qualitative effort. And as a COVES community, thinking about how we can do this reliably, do you have thoughts about how this might extend to COVES down the road?
As Amy said at the very beginning, one of our goals is to be able to have both enough of an understanding of this concept that may, and which so far you should be noting, it's a complex concept that includes multiple layers. Can we potentially ultimately write a question that we could all share? I'm guessing it would be a multi-part question. It's not going to be just, hey, did you feel a sense of belonging as you came today? Yes, no, maybe. But let's start to think about, could we ask about different aspects of belonging in ways that could become actionable for all of us? So we might be able to say, wow, at SMM, we've really been working on the physical nature of belonging. And we really want to see, are we changing that for visitors over time? Can we look at the overall trajectory of that question? And can we disaggregate that question for visitors who have disabilities, for visitors who speak languages other than English, for visitors who this is their first visit to the museum? Social support, again, let's look at what have we been doing and can we start to ask? We're not going to say to visitors, how was your social support for your sense of belonging today at the Science Museum of Minnesota? That would be a bad question. But can we ask that question in a visitor-centered way that allows visitors to pull apart and give us data? So that is ultimately our goal here. It is a multi-stage process because belonging is one of those things that we all sort of feel, we feel it in our bones. That's why Sarah made you think about your instinctive reaction to it as we started this. And what we're seeing from visitors is this multi-part piece. So we want to do it right. We don't want to do it quick. And then we all get sort of data that we're like, we don't know what to do with it. But our goal would be in a couple of years to have a question that we would bring back to the COVES community, keep on working with you all along the way, and hopefully be able to say, this should be on the survey. And also you all could use it in any other survey that you wanted to do, not just on COVES.
I love that, obviously. We've got a minute and change left. Any final responses, comments, questions for the SMM research team while we have them? Of course, if you think of things afterwards, we can definitely connect you, or you can email them directly if you've got those email addresses. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for this presentation. It's wonderful work that you're doing. You can sense the excitement, either based on the total number of participants, which may have been a record, and just the sheer number of chats. So good work. Can't wait to see you in Boston tomorrow. Are you here? What's happening? It's very soon.
Yeah.
Very soon.
Thursday.
Cool. And we collectively look forward to an update as you continue this work. And we'll be sure to bring you back to the COVES community in one way or another to share some of your final products. So thank you again, Evelyn, Sarah, Amy, Marjorie, for this outstanding effort. And thank you everyone else for attending today and your interest in belonging. We will see you next month, if not sooner, in one way or another. Take care, everyone.